Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Book 11 of Augustine's Confessions contains some pretty deep metaphysical examination of the nature of time. And one of the features of time that Augustine uses as, you could say, a fulcrum to analyze what it is that time actually is the fact that we can perceive intervals of it, and we, at least we think, can measure it. And this is going to come up already in chapter 15, where he brings up the notions of long time and short time. And then in chapter 16, he's going to say, we perceive, we sentere, right? Intervals of time, we compare them to one another, and we say that some are longer and some are shorter, and we measure how much longer or shorter this time may be than that. And we say things, for example, like this time is twice or 3 times as long as another, or that one is identical with or just as much as this. And he says, what we're measuring in these cases is actually passing times, and we make these measurements in perceiving them. So far, so good. This is something I think all of us, unless we're being contrarians, can probably agree with, but it doesn't solve the questions that he has. In fact, what we're going to see throughout these examinations of measuring time, it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. He says, past times no longer exist, future times don't exist. Who can measure those, except perhaps a person rash enough to say that they can measure what does not exist? So while time is passing by, in some kind of present, it can be perceived and measured, but when it has passed by, can we actually measure it then? And, you might pause and think for a moment about the fact that we exist in an era, I almost said time, but an era in which we have all sorts of ways of measuring time. We can get our cell phones out and start a stopwatch. We have clocks everywhere on all sorts of devices. But what Augustine is saying is actually true. We can say, it was 2 o'clock and now it's 4 o'clock, so I guess 2 hours have passed. Are we actually measuring those 2 hours? What's going on there? So this is kind of a puzzle. And he's going to come back to this in chapter 21, where he says, I just said a little while ago, we measure passing times so that we can say this tract of time is double that single one, or this one is just as long as the other. And whatever else as to periods of time we can describe by our measurements. And I was saying we measure passing times. So if somebody says to me, how do you know this? I can say, well, I know it because we make these measurements, and we can't measure things that don't exist, and neither past nor future things exist. But that's not solving anything. How do we actually measure present time? Because present time, it does exist in a certain way, but it doesn't exist all at once. I mean, it is passing, right? We only get a tiny slice of it. So he says, well, we measure it as it's passing by, once it's passed by, it's not measured because it doesn't exist anymore. And so he says, well, where does it come from? Well, from the future. By what path except the present? What place except into the past? So this is going to raise some tricky conundrums, right? It's from that which does not exist by that which lacks space and into that which no longer exists. And Augustine is going to bring up a really important consideration here. He says, what do we measure if time isn't in a certain space, right? We have this tendency, and this has been noted by people all the way down to the 20th century, to take time and to treat it as if it's analogous to space, when it really isn't. So he says, we don't say single or double or threefold or equal or anything of this sort in the order of time, except with regard to tracts of time. So we don't measure time in a sort of space. So what are we actually doing then? And here we're going to get a couple different proposed answers or models for what time is. So in chapter 23, he says, some people say that the movements of the sun and moon and stars constitute time. That's one way of thinking about the heavenly bodies. They provide us with something like a clock or a calendar or whatever it is that we're going to call it. And we do measure days by, the sun going around, or actually us going around the sun. We now know that. We measure months, maybe, at least in some cases, by the moon. Maybe some of the other heavenly bodies can help us with that. That doesn't really help us much with hours, although, we do have like sundials and stuff like that. And Augustine says, that doesn't really work. Why would we focus just on heavenly bodies? Why not rather the movement of all bodies be times? And he says, consider this. If the lights of heaven should stop while a potter's wheel was kept moving, are we really going to say that because the lights in the heavens aren't moving, that there's no time for that potter's wheel? So, he says, no, that doesn't make sense at all. Or while we're saying this, would we not also be speaking in time? Some of our words would have long syllables, others short. So it's clear that the stars and lights of heaven don't give us time itself. And he goes on and he says, I desire to know the power and nature of time by which we measure bodily movements. And I say, for example, that this movement is twice as long as that. And he says, maybe we can think about how it is that we understand a day. Is a day the movement of the sun itself? Or is it the period of time in which the sun moves relative to our point of view? Or perhaps it's both. And so he says, I don't actually have a good answer for this. So I'm not going to ask, what is it that's called a day? Instead, I want to know, what is time by which we would measure the sun's circuit and say it was completed in half the time it usually takes if it were finished in a period like 12 hours? How do we compare these things to each other, right? So another possibility would be, and this is in chapter 24, what if somebody says time is the movement of a body? And he says, well, a body's never moved except in time. So I measure in time how long the body is moved from when it begins to be moved until it stops. If I didn't see when it begins and it continues to be moved, I'm unable to measure it. And if I look at it for long, I can merely report it's for a long time, but not actually how long. When we say how long, we are measuring by making some sort of comparison, such as this is as long as that or twice as long as that. So he says, if we can mark off the distances of the places from which and to which the body that's moved or its parts, if it's moved on a lathe, we can say in how much time the movement of that body is completed. So there is a connection to spatiality in that way. But he says the movement of the body is one thing, and that by which we measure how long it's another. So the second is better called time. And time is not going to be just the movement of a body. So we've already eliminated two sort of candidates. A little bit later, chapter 26, he says, all right, well, how do I measure time itself? Right? I know that I do it. How the hell does that happen? So he says, do we measure a longer time by a shorter one? Just as we measure the length of a rod by the length of a cubit, two different spatial lengths. He says, well, it seems like that. We measure the length of a long syllable by the length of a short syllable. Now, what does that mean? So in Latin, as in Greek, they had some syllables in some words that were longer and some that were shorter. This is part of how they actually did meter in their poetry. Their poetry was not rhyming in the sense that ours is, typically with end rhymes. It was based on meter. So a word could be said in such a way that one syllable takes twice as long as another one, and you could measure it that way. So he says we measure the length of a poem by the length of the verses by the length of the feet by the lengths of syllables, and the length of long syllables by the length of short ones. So it seems like we've got something that's a actual yardstick, you might say, short syllables in this case. So maybe we're getting to the point where now we've got, some sort of success. Well, not exactly, because we can take short syllables and we could stretch them out in the way that we talk. So that's not going to help us that much. And we can do this for a poem, for a foot, for a syllable. So he says, it seemed to me that time is nothing more than distension, but of what thing I still don't know. And the marvel is if it's not of the mind itself. And now we're getting to a answer here. So in chapter 27, he's going to say, all right, so what is going on when we're measuring time? And I'm going to jump ahead in this. He says, we measure the interval from some beginning up to some sort of end. A voice that is never brought to a stop couldn't be measured, right? Or be said to be equal to something or else. But we do measure tracts of time. How does that actually happen? And he uses an example of a short phrase. And he says, well, where am I actually measuring this? Here's his great contribution. Well, it's in our minds, or in my mind specifically, that I'm measuring time. And it seems to him like it's specifically in his memory. He says, here we go. The present state is what I measure, not the things that pass away, so that it's made. How is it that when we measure stretches of silence and say that the silence has lasted for as much of the time as the discourse lasted, do we not apply our thought to measurement of the voice just as though it were sounding, so that we can report about the intervals of silence in a given tract of time? And he says, how do we actually have we could call it yardstick metaphorically, by which to do this? So this is where we get to his solution in chapter 28. And he asks some questions. How is the future, which doesn't exist, diminished or consumed? How does the past, which no longer exists, increase? Unless there's three things in the mind which does all that. What are these three things? These are activities of the mind. So it looks forward, expectat, right? It is anticipating would be another way to translate that. It considers, attendit, it pays attention, and it remembers, memineret. And so he says, who denies that future things are not existent? But in the mind, there's an expectation of things to come. Past things no longer exist. That's fine. There's still in the soul the memory of past things. Who denies that the present time lacks spatial extent since it passes away in an instant? But attention abides, and through it, what shall be present proceeds to become something absent. So he can draw some conclusions. It's not future time, which doesn't actually exist, that is long, but we have a long expectation of what is yet to come in the future, right? And he says that the same thing goes for the past. It's not past time, which is long, but a long past is a long memory of the past. Where is all that happening? Within the mind. Not out there in the world, in the human mind in this case. Or we could even say, to a certain degree, in the divine mind, although God's, you can't even say experience of time is different than our own. So he says, take for example, if I'm going to recite a psalm, before I begin, my expectation goes over the entire psalm. Once I've begun, my memory extends over as much of it as I shall separate off and assign to the past. The life of this action of mine is distended into memory by reason of the part I've spoken and into forethought by reason of the part I'm about to speak. But attention is actually present, and that which was to be is borne along so as to become past. This is how the human mind puts together present, past, and future, and carries out measuring of that. So he says the more that this is done and done again, the more the memory lengthens by a shortening of expectation until the entire expectation is exhausted. When this is done, the whole action is completed and it passes into memory. So what takes place in the whole psalm takes place in each of the parts and in each of its syllables. The same thing holds for a longer action, of which perhaps the psalm is a short part. The same thing, he says, holds for a person's entire life, the parts of which are all the person's actions. So not only can we take a poem that has a kind of past, present, future, all connected together that we can live through. We can think about our life that way. And he goes on to say, the same thing holds throughout the whole age of the sons of men, human beings, the parts of which are the lives of all men, right? So we in our minds can actually anticipate times that are far too long for us, or in a certain sense, remember times that are long past even before we began to live. And so this offers at least a preliminary conception of what time is, at least insofar as it's something that we can measure. And according to Augustine, now we know that the measuring of time takes place in our mind, we could say, or we might also say through or by our mind.